In this video, I'm going to be showing you how to use bump maps to create texture or add detail to your objects for 3D printing. So I'm going to start by creating a cylinder, and first I'll just create a new layer so that we don't wrap the background around our object. Go to 3D and create a mesh from preset. Oh, and source will use the selected layer. There we go. So we'll just create a basic cylinder, and I'll just use this to demo how bump maps work. And basically, bump maps are kind of a way to cheat and add extra detail to things without actually affecting the mesh itself. So if I click on the cylinder material, you can see that there's this thing called bump. And what the bump is it's basically a map. And the map works with black and white and any tones in between black and white to create this idea of depth. And that depth is going to be applied to the surface of the 3D object. So if I go to bump and click on this little file here and click on new texture, it's actually going to create this new document here. So I'll just use the same settings I used for this file, and then I'll click new. And when you do this, it'll open up a PSB, just like when we're editing the diffuse texture. It'll be the same idea. So what I can do here is just go ahead and paint some white and black on this layer to show you what it's going to do. And actually, the first thing I'll do is fill this layer with 50% gray, because when you fill it with 50% gray, basically the gray part is going to not affect the surface at all. Anything that's white is going to actually push out, and anything that's black is going to push in terms of depth. So let's go ahead and take a basic brush here, and we'll just use a hard brush of 80 pixels, and we'll just make some black dots really quickly here, and just some white dots, just to show you what's happening. There we go. And then we'll go ahead and save this cylinder material. And you can see what it did is it actually applied a little bit of depth to those dots. And so that's how it works. And if I go back to the 3D panel here and click on cylinder material, this bump percentage is going to affect how much texture that bump map applies to this object. And so, oops, let's go back there. So if I turn this up, it'll actually make those things deeper. And one thing to note is that these bump maps are pretty arbitrary. The way that these 3D programs interpret them kind of depends on a lot of different things. So in the 3D mode here, you can see that it's not adding that much depth, but if I actually went and 3D printed this thing, it would actually be more depth. And when you render it for 3D print, you'll see a better approximation of what it's going to do. So even though it doesn't look like it's doing that much, these would actually stick out a decent amount if I went to 3D print. So let's go ahead and just try that really quick. So if I go to 3D and go to 3D print settings, I'm just going to go through my normal process here. So we've got the MakerBot Z18, we got everything we need, and let's just go ahead and click on this to prepare the mesh. And you can see these things are actually sticking out a decent amount. So it actually does a pretty decent job of adding some depth. And you can see it even had to add a little bit of a support structure to these pillars to have it print. So that little orange piece is a piece of scaffolding that it added that's going to help support this as it prints. And that you would peel off technically if you were to print this. But let's click cancel, because this is not actually something I want to create. And let's go back into our bump map and try something else really quick. So we'll click on cylinder material. Oops, there we go. Click on cylinder material. And let's go back here and edit our bump map texture again. So let's get rid of these dots, and let's just go ahead and fill it with 50% gray again. There we go. In this case, let's just use a softer, bigger brush and try something else. There we go. So we'll get a pretty big brush going. And we'll just paint some white and some black. There we go, and some white. So what we're doing here is we're basically modeling our surface. So let's go ahead and save that. And you can see when I come back into Photoshop here that there's just a little bit of a modeling that's happening on here. Let's go into the 3D print again, just to see what we're going to get as an output. So we'll go to 3D print settings, and we'll click on this again to prepare the mesh. And this can sometimes take a decent amount of time, because basically what it's going to do is it's going to take your bump map, interpret it, and actually change the mesh to represent what that map is doing. So let's just give that a moment to process, and I'll be back when it's finished. Okay, so it just finished, and you can see that when I look at this object, it actually modeled it quite a bit. And so I'm getting this really, really cool 3D modeling, and it looks really organic and custom. And so this can be a really good way to create some really interesting detail to your shapes. One issue that I had here is that the mesh is continuous, so it wraps all the way around. So the point where one end of the mesh hits the other end creates this awkward seam. And so if you want it to be perfectly continuous, you actually have to match up one side of the mesh with the other so that it perfectly aligns. In this case, we didn't do that, so we have this seam. So just something you have to be worried about when you're using bump maps. But that's all I wanted to show you. Just a really simple way to create a lot of detail and interesting shapes out of your 3D objects. So hope that's helpful, and I'll see you next time.